Hey folks, David Stewart here. They don't make them like they used to. Everything made today is cheap, garbage, disposable crap. We should make refrigerators the way they used to make them in the 1950s. Look how good this refrigerator from the 1950s. Here it is. 7 years later, it still works. What's the problem with this? Well, there's a truth to this, and then there's some missing information, because what you're looking at here is a kind of selection bias. There's basically a gate where a bunch of information is eliminated and some information is kept, and that makes you think that the information is kept represents all the information. This happens a lot. So yeah, they don't make refrigerators as good as they made them in the 1950s if you are looking at refrigerators from the 1950s which are still running. That's because those refrigerators happen to be made exceptionally well and were able to run for many decades without requiring maintenance or requiring very little maintenance, and were able to stand up to the wear and tear of use for a long time. Now, what you don't see are the refrigerators that were made in the 50s that broke down and were thrown away. What you don't see are the refrigerators that were made in the 50s which were poorly designed and ended up in a junkyard fairly quickly. And you don't see the same models of those refrigerators that maybe just had one little defect and also ended up in the garbage. What remains, because of the process of elimination, as things break down, they're thrown away, especially closer to their manufacturing date, when people are not going to say, oh, well, I really like this cool refrigerator from the 50s and I like to fix it back up and preserve it. Before people had that inclination, they just tossed the old piece of garbage and bought a new one because that's what's easier to do. So even the same model of Frigidaire that you had from the 50s, a lot of them broke down because they maybe had a slight defect, and the one that still remains happened to be without defect. It was like completely perfect and ready to go. Or you have ones that, for whatever reason, they were put with an owner that maintained them better than other people would actually maintain the same property, and thus it survived. So you're missing like all the stuff that was made that's crap. So this happens whenever you look at anything from the past, whether it's toys or anything else. What you don't see is all the crap that ended up in the landfill. So like I have my Ninja Turtle toys, and it's like these Ninja Turtle toys from when I was a kid, I gave them to my son. They're so much better than the toys that are made today. So it's easy to say, well, the toys made in the 80s and 90s are better than the toys today. They are if you're just looking at the Ninja Turtle toys, which happen to be very high quality, or a couple of other toy lines. What you're missing is like those dollar store toys that just got thrown away. The little grocery, remember they had that toy aisle in the grocery store where maybe you got like a little dart gun or like a little wrestler or something. All those ended up in the landfill because they broke and were tossed. So there was plenty of crap from the 80s and 90s. We just didn't preserve it. We preserved the stuff that was worth preserving. We preserved the stuff that had meaning. We preserved the stuff that was well made and could even survive being passed on to the next generation. You know, some toys, the plastic's just going to rot into nothing before I can hand it down to the next generation. What's cool about Ninja Turtles or my Legos, right? My Legos have remained from the 80s and some of them from the 70s for my son to play with now, more than 30 years later. How cool is that? Well, were Legos made better in the past? Actually, they were a little bit. So this is one of those cases where I can compare like to like in the present. And that is the Legos that were made in the past compared to the Legos now. There's some things that I notice about them. And one of them is that the bodies on the little minifigures do not crack as much. The newer minifigures get a lot more cracked bodies. They're still very high quality, but they clearly have not stood up the way that my original ones did, because my original ones, I played with them nonstop, handed them to my kid. He plays with them. He still doesn't break them, but the newer ones do get broken being played with by the same kid. So the 30-year-old one, it's not like, oh, well, I threw away all the crap ones. I kept all my Legos, and I had a big sample of them. So in this case, it's one of those things where like they actually don't make them quite as good as they used to. I will say though that in general, Lego has maintained its quality pretty good over the last few decades. But a lot of things, hey, they don't make them the way they used to. Not everything that was made in the 60s was like a fastback Mustang. A lot of it were cars that were going to naturally end up in the junkyard because they weren't meant to last that long. They weren't that well made. They weren't that well designed. They weren't that loved. They weren't iconic. They didn't have anything special about them that required a user to maintain them and keep them around and not turn them into little squished cubes 30 or 40 years ago. So by their nature, the idea that like, oh, Mustangs were better than the other cars of the day because we kept them, That's not true, nor were cars in the 60s necessarily better than they are today, because there are some cars from the 60s that persist today and are able to be maintained and are able to run when other cars today break down. In fact, if I were to compare like cars today to cars yesterday, the newer cars are actually better. They're better designed, they're engineered with better tolerances, they stand up to more punishment and things like that. Really, in a lot of ways, new cars are better, but you get a little bit deceived when you look at only the cars that have survived over these however many years to make it down to today. And I think that's true with anything. Musical instruments, the crap ones get thrown in the Sears Silvertone guitars get thrown away, but the Les Pauls get maintained. And so you think, oh, the guitars from the 60s were so much better than they are today. Well, if your sample is Les Paul guitars and, original Fender made guitars from the early 60s, then yeah, they're better made. But yeah, you're not looking at the Sears Silvertone guitar, which got junked because it was a piece of crap. You're not looking at that kind of stuff and bringing that into the equation because it's not there to be seen. So thanks so much, guys. I'll see you next time. Give me an example of something that's like, hey, they made it better. They actually made it better in the day. I want to know if there's things that are like, these legitimately were made better in the day. Like, one thing I can probably say is like tube amplification stereo equipment was probably better in the day if you're comparing it to like transistor stuff. Like, I think we went to transistors because they were cheaper, not because they were really better in any specific way. But I don't know. You give me an example of something that's like, this was legitimately better made in the day. I think even with tube amps like guitar amps, all the crappy and I have a crappy tube amp from the 50s. I should show you guys sometime. Most of the crappy tube amps from the 50s just got junked, and we kept the Fender black faces because they were good, and we kept the Vox amps because they were good, and you kept the Marshall amps because they were good, and then you just thought they were all that same quality, and that was the quality that you got in the 60s. But that's not really the case for most things. So anyway, see if you can give me an example of like, this was legitimately better made in the past than it is today. I'd be interested to think about some good examples that way. So thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time.